Russia has been at war with Ukraine for over 34 months, and today we want to examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Robke, and this is BILD Situation Room. We start off in the western Russian region of Kursk, where Russian military forces are endeavoring to break through the Ukrainian defense lines with the support of North Korean mercenaries. We have acquired some new footage depicting the extent to which many North Korean soldiers are at times seen charging en masse at the Ukrainian forces, only to then be killed by the hundreds in the ensuing clashes. We are examining the footage and initially observe a surveillance camera feed from the Ukrainian armed forces. And this camera shows us, due to the thermal signatures, that there are many North Koreans within this forest area. But here too, even beyond the flags, we can look at this. These are the individual people who are also moving towards them. As mentioned, the whole thing is now monitored from above by a drone and also from the ground. And we are about to see the footage coming from the Ukrainian soldiers who recently took over defense here. These are truly intense images reminiscent of those from World War II or perhaps even the Korean War. So we keep seeing the North Koreans repeatedly charging at the Ukrainians' position here, and we see the Ukrainians looking to see where the next attackers are coming from and then killing them, mostly with their AR-15 rifles. We can sometimes even see how they're literally just a few meters away. Of course, we have pixelated it, but you can partially see the legs of the North Koreans moving towards them. That means these are really recordings that show how close they get. The Ukrainians are now sitting here, preparing themselves, being informed from the air about where the next ones are coming from, and then kill large numbers of North Korean soldiers. Current footage shows that while we repeatedly see some North Koreans still alive, others have already been killed. And these are ever-increasing numbers, with reports that out of the 12,000 soldiers, 4,000 have already been killed or wounded in Kursk. This implies that 1/3 of the soldiers, which were sent by Pyongyang, or rather by Kim Jong-un himself, have already lost their lives in Western Russia. And now we see here, quite interestingly, that the Ukrainians, after defending the position and repelling the entire North Korean attack, do not stay there, but instead they are moving away from here. That means they want to avoid being attacked with artillery fire or kamikaze drones. And that's precisely why 2 Humvees are now approaching them, effectively evacuating the soldiers we recently observed through the helmet camera from this particular position. That means the attack was successfully repelled. There are dead North Koreans everywhere, and I would say in relative calm, definitely not in panic. It's not a retreat. The Ukrainians are currently making their way out to locate a new forested area where they can effectively fend off any future attacks from the North Koreans. We remain in the region and see that it's not only people, namely North Koreans in this case, but also material that the Russians are having to face incredible losses in Kursk. Have made public some additional materials originating from Kursk that involve Russian soldiers. And these soldiers, after successfully taking over a position, recorded once more what they had utilized as well as what they had lost in their efforts to finally get there. And we can see these vehicles here. The first one is an MTLB, which unfortunately has gotten stuck at this position. However, as the camera moves further, you can see a BTR-80 here, and it continues onward. There are vehicles in the back too, but hard to identify. And here, really, the scrap piled up there in the corner, that's a BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicle we see here, and then several others almost stacked right on top of each other in an unusual manner, that literally exploded en masse to seize this position. Oddly enough, you can no longer distinguish exactly how many there are. However, we see that in front, that's probably a BMP-2, and here the turret is, however, on this infantry fighting vehicle the wrong way around. That means there were catastrophic explosions here that first blew off the turret, but then later, of course, due to gravity, it fell back down and landed right on this armored vehicle. Behind it, we can see more of the Russian military vehicles, which were extensively used for launching an attack here. In the end, they managed to seize control of this position. Nonetheless, around 6 or 7 armored vehicles unfortunately got stuck exactly at this spot. And we have more footage from Kursk, quite remarkable footage in my opinion, because they reveal to us that North Korea has transported additional new multiple rocket launchers to the location of Kursk. Those are indeed extremely strange recordings. It shows us in a part controlled by Russia, still outside the combat zone, that there's a truck which at first looks like just a normal truck. However, we observe something unusual emerging at the top, specifically a total of 12 tubes which appear to be functioning as launch pads. In this instance, it is relatively easy to observe the point from where BM-21 Grad rockets or related 122mm Grad rockets manufactured in North Korea are being launched. And for anyone who might say that's simply not possible, that such an unusual vehicle here actually resembles a rocket launcher truck, you will soon be thoroughly convinced otherwise. For we have footage from North Korea from the year 2023 showing, as we can see here, that Kim Jong-un has had exactly such terror tools manufactured. Namely vehicles that resemble from the outside some kind of freezer boxes or something, appearing like a completely ordinary transport truck. We even see that the drivers are in white, unlike the soldiers behind them, with their camouflage strategically employed to catch the enemy completely by surprise, cleverly making it look just like an ordinary civilian truck, which at the ideal moment unleashes its full payload of 12 rockets. 122 millimeters as mentioned, with a range of about 20 kilometers. This means we see that North Korea is not only sending its soldiers to die in the course, but is also increasingly sending its weapon systems, partly even some that were only introduced 2 years ago. From the west of Russia, we move to the south of Ukraine here in the Zaporizhzhia region and see that Ukraine has clearly received new ammunition for their home defense artillery. We recall HIMARS systems were sent from the USA, over 70 units. However, in recent months, there have been very few videos because there was very little ammunition left. Now we know that just before the year came to a close, both governments decided to send a substantial amount of ammunition once again. That was also public in the media, and now, several weeks later, we see that this ammunition is being used again. We see here, as mentioned, footage from a so-called Shark drone, a surveillance drone from Ukraine, filming 2 Buk systems, Russian anti-aircraft systems in Zaporizhzhia, and we are about to see the M30 ammunition from HIMARS. That's cluster munitions with 400 small bomb slots so that they hit this one system here. So we see here is the system, there's the other one, it remains unaffected, and then we see around it this large explosion radius. So we can at least see one of the systems here again in zoom. Was struck by these M30 rockets, which possess an impressive and extensive approximate operational range of 84 kilometers. This entire area lies halfway between the front lines and Mariupol, putting it at approximately 50 kilometers within the Russian-occupied zone. And we can see here that another troop concentration is being attacked. Here you can see a tank belonging to the Russian army and several infantrymen surrounding it. As mentioned, located far from the front, so the soldiers here expect nothing bad or an attack. However, this Shark drone with its very large range of over 100 kilometers has caught them, or at least spotted them. And what we can observe here are numerous Ural trucks, possibly even that somewhat resembles an electronic warfare system that's parked right here. And we can see that these different vehicles are now apparently coming under attack. Here you can clearly see again that the tank we just saw is here, along with the 2 vehicles, and there's also a 4th vehicle standing there. And now we'll see that M30 rockets are being used again. However, to be completely honest, the 2 Ural trucks on the left and right are not hit. Once more, they were positioned here and here. The tank was right here, and the impact circle is approximately around this area. However, we keep seeing additional explosions on the tank with each of the impacts. This indicates that we can reasonably infer that at least this heavy tracked vehicle, together with the infantry stationed around it, have suffered substantial damage and incurred considerable losses in this scenario. But still a good sign for Ukraine. After months, there are now more of these new videos showing us that they are using HIMARS systems again. If fewer videos appear over a longer period, it doesn't mean that Ukraine doesn't have any more, but it means, of course, that they want to maintain a strategic reserve, with which you just manage resources accordingly, and only when new rockets are delivered, then you use the existing ones again. Next, we want to watch a very, very harsh, very cruel video, which once again shows how Russia is criminally as a war criminal operating in Ukraine. We have a compelling video that was recently uploaded by Russian soldiers onto Telegram just last night. And this video evidently shows us in a very deliberate and intentional manner how Ukrainian prisoners of war are killed, executed systematically one after another. Let's briefly go back to the beginning of the scene. We see a Ukrainian position in the Donetsk region. This fact has now been disclosed by the Attorney General. In the Donetsk region, this particular Ukrainian position is being overrun by the advancing Russian troops. Here we see, for example, some of the Russians, and the Ukrainians are all lying on the ground in various positions. Each person is disarmed, and they are all just waiting patiently to be taken away so that they can become standard prisoners of war. However, the Russians have a different plan in mind. Their ultimate goal is to kill every one of the soldiers present here. In a cunning move, it seems they agreed beforehand on who would shoot whom. We find ourselves in the situation now where one of the Russians openly declares, "I wish to shoot everyone." It seems to be the commander, referred to as Stara. Another soldier claims that particular one as his target, openly expressing his desire to shoot him and requests for him. And that happens as the video progresses. As I said, very disturbing scenes. At the beginning, there's still a drone alert here. This means the soldiers are waiting until this drone is gone, as they're not quite sure if it's a Ukrainian or Russian one. But once that's over, they begin. The soldiers, there are 6 in total, prompting each one individually to stand up and relocate themselves a bit further away. Over there by those tree trunks, which is basically where the execution site has now been established and brought into view, that's the location where all the Ukrainians are intended to be executed. And we see once again that the commander is about to hand over the video, or rather the phone, and is now preparing a new magazine. Loads up his rifle and then with great pride repeatedly insists, film me, I want you to make sure you capture me on video while I kill everyone here. And now we see how the Ukrainians are being told to leave. At first there's confusion because the Ukrainians also don't expect that they are about to be executed. They think first they should somehow grab their phones, should film something, but it was a misunderstanding, which the Russians then laugh about loudly. And we subsequently observe how the Russians are about to soon begin the execution of their prisoners of war. These are truly gruesome scenes, but unfortunately they fit a pattern we've seen repeatedly over the past few months. The Russians are executing more and more Ukrainian prisoners of war at the moment. As I said, we pixelate that and don't show the sound either. In the object, the first 2 Ukrainians have now been killed here. And now, one by one of those who are still alive are being commanded and more or less guided to that designated place. And then unfortunately they are shot there as well. Yes, these are truly terrible images, which once again show us that Russia has indeed become a terrorist state. And the military force, which is known as the Russian army, is indeed an army made up of terrorists who both eagerly and willingly who commit these war crimes and film them. They want them exposed. Ukrainian activists also told us that today it's about demoralizing the Ukrainian army, and it's about the fact that Ukrainian soldiers are no longer reporting for the war, or in case of an emergency, while one after another is being shot behind us, that in a worst-case scenario, the soldiers indeed desert or try to oppose the army because they know, and they should know, that's why the Russian soldiers do this here, that they have no chance to survive. So even if should their position be overrun, and we know that since at least the autumn of 2023, that the front only moves in one direction towards the west, so all positions either have to be abandoned or overrun, that they unfortunately have no real chance to survive in such conditions. Quite brutal and unsettling footage that we are compelled to release today because it is vital to show how the Russian army is proceeding in its ongoing war against Ukraine. Therefore, it stands as a significant contemporary witness, which we simply must not hide or conceal here. We stay in the Donetsk region and see that the Russian military leadership not only treats enemy soldiers incredibly poorly, but also their own soldiers. We have recently obtained some interesting new footage of a recent Russian attack in the Donetsk region. This footage clearly shows us that after tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and sometimes even Chinese buggies, at least partially motorcycles, are being used by the Russian army to attack positions. There's another one back there, positions of Ukraine. And this attack, it's actually quite highly suicidal because it only works somewhat well as long as you're constantly moving. However, as soon as you dismount your motorcycle, and we'll see this in a moment, you become easy prey for the Ukrainian drones, which observe everything from several kilometers away. So we can see here that this group of motorcycles has come to a brief halt. I believe it's 8 or 9 pieces. And at that moment, however, the Ukrainians immediately start sending their drones. And we are now witnessing a true massacre among the soldiers. First, this group is completely wiped out. The motorcycles are systematically destroyed one after the other as they are attacked by drones, but also the soldiers who then try to find cover on the left and right descending there. Here we see one of the motorcycles which still exists. These soldiers are being taken one by one into all these trenches and buildings where they're trying to take cover, attacked by the Ukrainian drones, and are killed one by one. That means this is another attack where someone thought it was a good idea to attack with 8 motorcycles and ended up with 8 fewer soldiers. They were with the Russian army, but let's review. It's part of the Russian strategy and overall calculus. This means one is indeed willing to lose up to 100% of their troops if, at the end of the day, it means gaining control over yet another completely destroyed village. And that there are not only motorcycles, but of course also tanks and infantry fighting vehicles we can see in further footage from the region, also from Donetsk. And we can clearly see here now that this is a T-80 tank, which is being utilized to launch an aggressive attack on a village located in Ukraine. His problem is, he was also spotted beforehand. Right at this moment, kamikaze drones are on their way to this tank as well. And the interesting thing is, we just talked about 8 motorcycles. Now we need to watch and see how many soldiers come out after the hit. Actually, the crew is 3. And we will see after the impact of a Ukrainian kamikaze drone in just a moment, there are also, as far as I've counted, at least 8 soldiers here. trying to find safety in the area. The first one has already exited. He's now standing over here, and currently we are observing soldiers descending from all directions. It's actually more akin to an armored bus, and we can highlight that here again, truly resembling more of an armored bus rather than what you'd usually think of as a real tank. These are just a few of the soldiers that can be observed here at the moment. Consequently, the Russian army requires some type of transport vehicle, whether it's T-80 tanks or something similar, be it civilian motorcycles, be it loaders, which we have also seen in recent weeks, to move his soldiers from point A to B. The entire situation doesn't function in the same way as it did at the beginning of the war, when there were still thousands of various vehicles available, because over 12,000 vehicles have now been lost in Ukraine, and many of those vehicles are simply no longer there. Partially, or at the very least, you always need some time to restore them in order to form a new wave of attacks. We see here that this T-80 is being attacked again, and it's very important to the Ukrainians to ensure it's no longer salvageable. And now we have a new video, and it shows us that at least one attack is still yes. Using somewhat reasonable military vehicles, we can clearly observe here that a T-64 tank was in all likelihood brought to a stop and then subsequently attacked. However, there are also two other vehicles. Here you can see it quite well again, the T-64, which is burning here, and two other vehicles, probably BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles, that are being attacked here. And we now see this from different perspectives, the impacts, and then we also see how over time these vehicles, now we have the catastrophic explosion behind it, are being attacked and destroyed one after another by the Ukrainians. That also means constantly emphasizing that another attack with 4 armored vehicles, even traditional military vehicles, all of these 4 vehicles are lost during the course of the attack. And the Russians, one must constantly keep in mind and remember, are losing several hundred of their soldiers each and every day. These are dead soldiers who perish in Ukraine just to advance somewhat a few more kilometers and take over control of completely ruined and devastated landscapes. And how the Russian army, despite all these suicide attacks, still continues to advance and eventually manages to capture new cities, can be relatively well observed in Velyka Novosilka, another city we've discussed repeatedly in the past few days. And this city could almost be completely surrounded, which means almost completely encircled by the Russian army. And we can see that this area here in the middle is still partly held by Ukrainians, partly contested, and partly not yet. But for the Ukrainians, the main problem is they can't exit the city anymore. There is only one remaining route that leads to the northwest, and this specific route, as I really hope you can see from the map, is unfortunately blocked by a river. And this river flows here, along the western outskirts of Velyka Novosilka. And the Russians are now specifically targeting this river in order to launch attacks on the retreating Ukrainian units there. We'll look at it in the video. These recordings, which I've highlighted, are somewhat hard to recognize. I hope they do it anyway. So here we have the fleeing Ukrainian soldiers trying to make their way across this river. And now let's take a moment to pause everything. Here is the river that we showed earlier, which is flowing or moving in this direction. The Ukrainians are making an attempt to flee in this direction. Right here, we can observe how the Russian army is aggressively bombarding the riverbank with artillery as they aim to obstruct and hinder the evacuation efforts. We also see the bright spots here. So these are most likely people being evacuated, which makes this evacuation extremely difficult. And yes, Ukrainian war bloggers are understandably quite upset that any troops are still present in this city at all, because it's really turning out to be extremely costly in terms of losses for the Ukrainian army. We must not forget that Ukraine is also losing over 100 men every day in this war. And now we can clearly observe how these bombardments are occurring here, all as a result of the recent loss of the area of Vremivka. Let's take another quick look at it. Vremivka, a small suburb in the southwest of the city, but it had a bridge. And this bridge right here, clearly visible, this bridge was indeed vital for the evacuation process of the Ukrainian army forces. But it was unfortunately lost. This means all of the remaining military troops still in the city, which seem to be several hundred, now have to be evacuated across the river, where there are no pontoon bridges. The Russians are too close, can just attack directly from nearby. And in that sense, it is a very dangerous evacuation operation that Ukraine is currently carrying out in order to then hand over Velyka Novosilka more or less to the Russians. We're going to explore 2 more videos today. First, we'll see the scenario of a Ukrainian drone launching an attack on a Russian drone. This is quite an interesting maneuver. It's a special unit of the Russian army that's about to launch an Orlan 10 drone. Orlan 10, as we recall, Russian surveillance drones currently being assembled. So it was carefully taken out of the vehicle. The computer is likely set up right here, and 2 soldiers are currently busy actively involved in operating this drone. It can cover a distance of approximately 70 kilometers, effectively coordinating ballistic missile strikes and being quite adept at conducting both surveillance and espionage activities. Where are Ukrainians moving? When are counterattacks expected? And so on. In this sense, a very important objective for Ukraine, which has managed to get very close to those systems, probably positioned 10, 20, 30 kilometers behind the front lines with the long range of their small FPV drones. Now we can see the approach of the FPV drone here. I have to admit, it's all very hard to see. This is the vehicle we just saw a moment ago. We now have an additional perspective where you can see this drone flying in and directly hitting one of the two special forces present there, one of the two operators. So the whole thing is really quite painful for the Russians because there are, of course, not many soldiers who can operate these computers and these All-in-10 drones. We witness the evacuation of the wounded individual. His comrade, rather than abandoning him, drags him back to the car and swiftly drives away with him to a safer area. And finally, we want to take a look at another drone versus drone attack. This time, however, not on the ground, but instead up in the air. It's indeed a remarkably intriguing type of drone that we're observing from the Russian side, more precisely a rather modern kamikaze drone of the Cub-2E model. And this Cub-2E has only been in use for a few months. It's kind of the successor to the Lancet. We see them here quite interestingly with their two wings directly one behind the other. And this drone was also attacked by Ukraine. I'll try to stop it at the right moment. And right here we can see the impact of this small FPV drone on the QB2E, about which not much information is known yet. It is believed to possess a warhead that is double the size of the Lancet, which naturally implies that it has the potential to cause significantly greater damage and destruction in comparison. The exact range is still unclear, leaving some questions unanswered. These Ukrainian recordings convincingly demonstrate that Russia is also actively using its kamikaze drones in the mid-sector. We're not discussing the FPVs, the small ones, nor the big models with their 800-kilometer range, but rather in the approximately 70 to 100-kilometer range segment that Russia has further developed its drone production there and now, after the Landsat also has another tool available with the Cub-2E to launch attacks on the Ukrainians far behind the front lines as well.